bell here in the Bronx still, and the cops that beat the pig, you know, Clara Lempley had 6 ribs broken.
She was attacked by a foe. She was attacked by a foe, hired by the licensing company, the boss of the licensing company. So it wasn't quite the same, but those police were brutal to the strikers, and the judges were sending them to the workhouse.
They were either brutal or they weren't paying attention, or they blinked because some of those police houses were being taken care of.
Well, they were being paid off,
and Tammany Hall was definitely not respecting the rights, especially of immigrant workers, and who were not voters or who didn't have political power. It was when the political power came from the Vanderbilts and the Morgans that they started to change their tune. So a lot of things, and if you look at the movement of the 60s, there usually is convergence of a lot of different social changes that are happening that makes an uprising continue to happen. So you have women's suffrage, and you have strikers, and the labor movement, and people saying enough's enough from different groups. And during the 60s, you have civil rights, and you have women's rights, and you have the war.
And gay rights.
And gay rights. And so that you have a lot of simultaneous movements happening that saying, masses of people saying enough's enough. And so that helps each other. But as you can see, when Morgan was finished with getting what she needed, she sort of backed out, and the groups became separated.
Just real quick question, what happened to the 2 gentlemen that owned that shirtwaist factory after they were acquitted? What happened to them, do you know?
They started another factory and they were fined for locking the doors.
I was wondering.
Yeah. but they got very rich.
Yeah. Right.
Mm.
They were making $1 million a year 100 years ago.
Oh my God.
I want to, just before I turn it over to our cultural workers, talk about, just put this bee in your bonnet of the question of women's imprisonment. Now, we're not speaking literally. I mean, they weren't in a jail, but, well, okay.
They were.
Now you agree with me.
Literally
There you go.
Yes, they were literally in prison. And it's interesting because Ann Morgan and Alva Belmont went, and Carola Warashoffer and a number of the other Mink Coat Brigade women would go to the Jefferson Market Courthouse where they took the strikers and would bail them out and use the deeds to their property as bail. And that was one of the things that supported the union. And the Women's Trade Union League was made up of middle class and upper middle class women who were supporting the strike, basically because they believed that the women were being poorly treated, and they needed, they wanted more feminist power and suffrage. But
But not for women of color.
Well, that's an interesting question, because there is evidence that women of color, black women, who were seamstresses in their own right, were encouraged to scab during the strike, during the uprising of the
They were encouraged to what?
They were encouraged to scab, to take the strikers' places. And their own, they were persuaded not to do so in a show of solidarity. So black women did not get involved in that strike and did not scab because their own socialist-leaning leaders and leadership prevented that. Now, I'm not sure of that exact history, and it's something that I'm really interested in looking into, because it's a real show of solidarity. Because normally, like in the Pullman strike and in mining strikes, they would recruit gangs of African Americans to go in and break up the strike, you know, basically to scab and to break up the strike. And that did not happen in this particular strike. And, you know, so there there is some evidence that the
Women
black
sticking
women
together.
were heeding that call of solidarity, not to get involved and not to
Also,
lose that.
Italians had a liminal position regarding how they were perceived racially.
Yes.
And,
this is
and a
what we're-
Bronx example is at the Castle Hill pool. There's a documented incident in a book called Are Italians White, edited by Jennifer Guglielmo. And the story is that this guy shows up to the pool, and they say, no one of color is allowed in. He says, but I'm a member. He says, well, where's your ID? So he says, well, my cousin's got my ID. So he's got to go call his family. And the point being, legally, we were white. Socially, we weren't always white. So when it came down to a hired thug beating a dark-skinned Italian online, you know, and there was a lot of, you know, you're Sicilian, you're African, right? Which Sicily's right there. So,
And Jews as well.
Well, there's a saying that goes, it wasn't until the end of the Second World War where Jews and Italians became white. You know, it's,
Charles.
So I just wanted to mention, because you were mentioning, there's a book called Beyond the Pale. I don't know if anybody's read that book. If you haven't, it's a really phenomenal book, and it's fiction, but it's about, you know, a young woman that starts out, you know, in Russia and Eastern Europe, and her family escapes the pogroms, and they come to the U.S. and they become involved in labor. It's just like a fictionalized tale of it. But what's really beautiful about it is that it's also a love story between two women, and it's also tragic.
What book is this?
It's called Beyond the Pale.
Beyond the Pale.
And it's
Beyond.
Yeah, the writer's, her name is a really fun, provocative name. It's Elana Dykewoman. That's what she calls herself. That's what the name she uses. But I read it. I had the great opportunity to study with her at a writer's workshop. And I read the book, and it was just, and I called her. I said, are you being brought in to New York because this is the 100th anniversary? And she said, well, no. You know, she goes, if you know, we don't have the budget to bring her in, but I would have loved to have had her here tonight. But I just wanted to mention the book to the room, and it's definitely worth reading. And I won't talk more about it because it just tugs your heart, and it just really, the way I think to a certain extent is interesting how this documentary, you know, documentaries are an art form because there's the way they dramatize, you know, what happened. It's not actual, but they give you kind of an emotional sense of what it was. And the same thing with this book, it totally, like, I went on an emotional roller coaster reading this book. And the fire is a part of the book too, is part of the history that happens. It goes through the whole thing from the Henry Street settlements and just really beautiful account of it. So I wanted to add that to the discussion.
Okay, well, I want
If I may take a moment, I just want to show you a picture. And I don't know whether this is going to come out, but this is a picture of, this is a picture of Clara Lemlin, who was the uprising of the 20,000 catalysts.
17 years old,
Okay.
right?
And, well, actually, she was 22, I
Oh,
understand.
okay.
Okay, and Pauline Newman, just after the strike. Okay, and this is one of those formal pictures, and if you can see it, they are so close. So, you know, our caption, Newman shared a letter she received from a coworker who wrote, "We shall be friends in joy and sorrow. What is there sweeter in life than the sympathy between woman and woman? What purer than the sincerity of hearts? What greater than the harmony of minds?"
All right. And she led the charge. She led
Let me just, you know, say, this is the book that we authored as part of the centennial commemoration, and we are quite proud of it. It's the largest collection of vintage photos that has been printed about the fire and the strikes leading up to it, and the efforts to make the workplace better for people afterwards by the ILGWU, and it brings it right up to the current day with the coalition.